Thanks for coming so early on a Saturday morning. My name is Joel Lehman. I'm an assistant professor at the IT University of Copenhagen, and I'll be talking about creative robots, or creative algorithms for robots. So this is a slide where I try to summarize the whole talk. So I'll be talking about three main concepts. One is the idea of evolutionary robotics, which is using processes inspired by nature, by evolution, to create controllers for robots. I'll also be talking about biological evolution, which is sort of the inspiration for that. And then third, I'll try to talk about innovation in general. So can we extrapolate from this microcosm of robots to try to talk about how innovation works in a broader sense. So one interesting thing about evolutionary robotics is that you actually have to write code that's going to innovate in some way. It's trying to search through a space of possibilities to create something that you want. So maybe you want to create a robot that accomplishes something. And so you actually have to figure out, how do I code innovation? And you try to drive it in that direction. So you try to encourage progress by some measure towards this thing. Another paradigm is something called Divergent Search, where instead of, it's looking at natural evolution as a process of open-ended exploration. It's not looking for anything in particular, but discovering lots of different stepping stones to everywhere. And so basically, these are incredibly complicated. And natural evolution is what crafted your body and what crafted all the creatures that we see on the Earth. And it's really, really amazing. I mean, if you really stop to think about how an unguided process could accomplish all these things, it's mind-blowing. And the most complex artifact that we know of in the entire universe is the human brain. Billions of neurons, trillions of connections. What's even more amazing is that with our human brains, our own intelligence, we can't yet match the engineering of natural evolution. Just really incredible. So one interesting thing about human intelligence is that we can understand the deep principles behind phenomenon that we see in biology, and we can take those principles and use those to engineer in a different medium. So birds flew, and once we understood the deep principles of flight, then we were able to create flight in an entirely different medium, or different, an artificial sense, that enabled us to do really incredible things. We could fly through the air on these enormous airplanes. So could we do something similar with evolution? If we could actually understand the deep principles of evolution that allow it to be so prolifically creative, could we transplant those into an algorithm? And if we could do that, maybe we could enable creating autonomous robots. I alluded to earlier that our cells are pretty much autonomous robots. So if we did truly understand natural evolution on that level, and we could create autonomous robots through this process, through an artificial process of evolution, maybe we could create robots to explore Mars by themselves, or in the case of a disaster scenario, maybe we could have robots that would find survivors very quickly. So that's kind of some inspirational things about natural evolution, sort of the grand vision of evolutionary robotics. And now let's go through some information, basically to give some background on how we actually think about how algorithms could be in fact creative. Talking about artificial evolution, which is sort of what we use in evolutionary robotics to create things. And I'll talk basically about, I'll show some videos about sort of current results. And I'll try to connect at the end this to some broader implications about how innovation works. So you might think that the idea of a creative algorithm is itself a little bit contradictory, and that when you think of an algorithm, you think of a mechanical process, and when you think of a mechanical process, you think you're not going to be surprised by what happens out of a mechanical process. You have some thing that the programmer is putting in, and it does some processing, and there's an output. So the idea of an algorithm creating art or something seems a little impossible at first. But I think it helps us to think about, if we rephrase creativity in a different way, we can see that there's maybe no contradiction at all involved in this. If we think of creativity as search, so an artist is sort of, you can think of an artist as searching through a space of all possible pictures when they're painting something. You can think of a sculptor as searching through the space of all possible sculptures. And what's useful about this is that we also know that computers themselves are kind of good at mechanical search processes. And so maybe there's some hope that they could do something like this. So when we think of going to Google and typing in a keyword, it's going to search through all these different web pages and find things that sort of mechanically match our search query. So this isn't really an example of creativity because it's calling through this pre-existing space, but we also then could start to ask the algorithm to search the space of all possible images. And if we have a mechanical measure of what we're looking for, then still it could create an image. So if we said to an algorithm, create an image that is as red as possible, it could mathematically perhaps rank images and find this is the most red image, and in some senses a really rudimentary form of creativity. But we can go a step further. So this is some research I was involved with a few years ago, and what we said was, here are some properties of images that we think might be interesting, symmetry, how compressible they are, what are the kind of the color values of them, and just return a divergent group of these sorts of images. So look at trade-offs among these properties, try to invent images that somehow span these spaces, and what you get are sort of interesting images. I'm not claiming that these are sort of profound art, but they were actually surprising when you saw them, and that you're kind of getting a little bit more out of the algorithm than you're putting in. You're saying span this space of properties and it'll actually create images wholesale. And to give you an idea of how that's possible, we can talk about the idea of an evolutionary algorithm. So you have some measure or something that's guiding a search process in a computer, and it's inspired by natural evolution. So on the left we have this image of DNA, which is how biological information transfers from generation to generation. And on the right I also have this sort of abstract space of shapes that I'll use to illustrate this concept. So you can kind of imagine a computer maybe generating some sort of artificial DNA that might create just shapes. It's more simple than creating organisms. So evolution happens independent of medium whenever you have these three ingredients. So whether in biology or in a computer, if you have heredity, variation, and selection, then you get some kind of evolutionary process. Heredity is the idea that you can make a copy of genetic material, so basically your offspring will somehow resemble you. And that happens in nature through DNA replication, but in a computer you can have some kind of artificial DNA, it's a bit string, you just copy that bit string, so then you have heredity. There's the idea of variation, that you can get new designs from old designs. So all these puppies came from the same parents, and yet they have subtle variation in their genetics. So in nature this happens through different mutations and crossover sort of mechanisms, and we can do something similar in a computer. We could actually just flip a bit to mutate something. If we wanted to cross over two pieces of artificial DNA, we just chop them down the middle and recombine them in that way. And so finally is the idea of selection. This is what actually gives guidance to the search process, and this is what I'll be talking more about as the talk progresses. In natural evolution, we have this idea of survival of the fittest. So here we have this eagle that is catching a fish, and this fish will provide energy for the eagle and maybe allow it to replicate, to have offspring, whereas the fish's genes are being culled out of the population. So maybe its skin was a little, was too shiny or something, and those genes that encode that shyness now maybe are going out of the population. So what's interesting is that in an algorithm, if we're trying to create an evolutionary algorithm, we have to decide how to select things. We have to decide what is going to go from one generation to the next. And this is where it intersects with models of innovation. So we have to decide how we want the algorithm to search through the space of possibilities. So here, let's imagine we have this space of squares, and what we really want is to create a black square. And so this is our initial population of 3 squares, and we can see that this one's maybe a little bit darker than the rest, so we think this maybe is a good place to start. So here we're going to have, this is kind of an example of an objective-driven process. If we're saying we want to get to a particular thing, let's say the black square, and we think that the way to get there is to try to get darker and darker squares. So let's say we select this guy, we throw away the other 2, and then we make offspring from this shape, and we get, once again, some variation in color. This one seems like it's the darkest, so we go with that one. We keep replicating these shapes. Maybe eventually we get to where we want to go. So we've bled our black square through this process, and this is just to give you an idea of how an evolutionary algorithm can work in practice. So it may not be so interesting to breed shapes. It's a nice illustrative example, but more interesting maybe to breed artificial brains for robots. So we can have these, if we want to actually evolve a behavior for a robot, if we want a robot to do something interesting, it'd be great if we had some way to evolve a controller for it. So to create an artificial neural network, we can once again take inspiration from biology, and we can look at the human brain, or just the brain in general, which is composed of neurons. And so if we want to create an artificial neural network, maybe we should first model an individual neuron. So here is just a diagram of an actual neuron, and on the right we have this very simple mathematical abstraction. Basically all this is saying that what a neuron does is that it takes some information from other neurons, there's a little bit of computation, and it sends a signal outwards. So it's a pretty simple model, and once we have this, then we can actually start to string them together. We can have a wiring diagram for these neurons, and the idea is that, as in a biological brain, the wiring diagram will encode some kind of information processing, and maybe we can get one of these neural networks to do something useful for us, to control a robot, for example. And what you can think about, one way to think about how you might search the space of brains is that you're searching through a space of different wiring diagrams for these things. So this is just a diagram of a very simple neural network. And you can imagine that there might be some changes you can make to this neural network over time. Like you might change one of the connections. You might add a new node. You might add another connection. And this way, you can actually grow the neural network over time as you search through different possibilities. So this is just some illustration of how you can kind of modify the wiring diagrams. So when we talk about how a robot and these artificial brains actually interface, what you can do is have the sensory information from the robot, maybe 30 or 60 times a second, be plugged into a neural network. The neural network will do some processing, and then signals from the output layer of this neural network can be then used to drive the motors of the robot. So in this way, if you do this many times a second, this really is a brain that's controlling that robot. And so you can plug a brain into a robot in some environment, and you can see what it does in that environment, and then at some point you can make a decision whether this particular brain merits further exploration or not. This is the idea of selection. So you, once again, you decide which brain we're going to use, and which brain we're going to use to kind of explore further from. So this is where we get into the idea of different ways you can guide the search. So I'll say that there's going to be two models here. One is this model of objective-based search that I mentioned early on in the talk. And the assumption here is that what makes evolution great, so we're taking inspiration from evolution, is that it's great at achieving particular objectives. So if you took kind of like just a snapshot of evolution, like this ape and this human, somehow evolution was able to get from there to there. And maybe it's great in general, just sort of optimizing at achieving things. And this is one paradigm of evolution used in evolutionary algorithms, used in evolutionary robotics. Now, if you want to actually apply this to a problem, you come up with a measure of how good a behavior is. So how good this thing is at achieving a goal. And then optimize that. So you're saying whatever is doing best at this measure is probably the best stepping stone to get to even better performance. A second model is something called Divergent Search. The assumption here is that maybe evolution achieves great things because it's not looking for anything in particular. It's exploring lots of different ways of life simultaneously, and maybe that's the key to how it's able to find such interesting things. So if we wanted to create some kind of divergent search in a computer, we could have a different process. So step one might be to have some measure of how different something is from something else, instead of how good it is. And then instead of trying to maximize this goodness measure, we just try to use this measure of differentness to accumulate lots of different things, accumulate lots of different stepping stones that kind of expand outwards. So these are the two different models you can use to guide the search. And the second idea, it might seem a little bit weird, the idea of guiding the search divergently, because you're not actually, you as an experimenter might have something you want to find. So you want a robot to do something. You want a biped robot to learn how to walk. It seems kind of crazy to say we're going to kind of throw away that information and just sort of accumulate different ways for the robot to walk, or some sort of other, some sort of divergent measure. So instead of just rewarding robots for increasing progress, like you might think would be the right way to do, you can kind of do it this way. So that was a little bit confusing. But when we look at actually how evolution itself innovates, it does seem to have this sort of branching divergent process, so maybe it's not so crazy to try it. So for example, a typical example of this is when you look at the feathers on a bird, for example, that enable a bird to fly. They first evolved for an entirely different purpose. They evolved actually for temperature regulation. So in order for the bird to get to wings that enabled flight, there was this sort of intermediate stepping stone that evolution sort of serendipitously came about that later enabled it. And similarly, when we look at processes, these are Darwin's finches. These finches all specialized to eat different things, and their morphology is different. They speciated, and this is another way that evolution innovated in a divergent way. So it wasn't that there was some uber beak that would satisfy everything, it was that evolution was expanding outwards, exploring lots of different ways of life for even these birds. So this slide is to give you an idea that evolution does sort of innovate in a very sort of branching way. And when we actually look at sort of the stepping stones that kind of led from our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents to us, it's a sort of branching path that it's not kind of clear that all the stepping stones along the way would lead to us. So, for example, one organism along the way to us was the flatworm, which is like the first thing to have bilateral symmetry. And it doesn't seem to resemble us in lots of ways, but that seems like it's a clear developmental sort of step towards what would later enable the complexity of us. Right, so, okay, to come back now to evolutionary robotics, we have these two models of innovation, and we can actually test them in different sorts of experiments to see which of them work better in particular places. So on the left, we have this sort of maze environment, and we can imagine a little sort of Roomba-like robot, a wheeled robot, starting here, and we want to actually evolve a brain for this robot that will get it to traverse the entire maze. On the right, we have this simulated biped robot, and we want it to learn how to walk. So these are two different test domains, and we can test in these test domains these models of objective-based or divergent search processes. So in this maze environment, if we try the objective-based approach, and here we're trying to reward robots for getting closer and closer to this goal, we hit this sort of cul-de-sac. And so this maze is actually designed explicitly to kind of highlight this principle, which is just that sometimes in order to make progress along your objective, so to actually get closer to this thing, you have to go further away first. So if we use a divergent search process instead, then we can actually find a policy for this robot that will actually take it all the way around. And this happens because if we are searching divergently through all the behaviors that can lead to everywhere in this maze, then we're not going to be sort of misled by this little confusing cul-de-sac. And similarly, if we look at this sort of this biped robot, so the one on the left is going to be the objective-based way of driving search, and the one on the right is going to be the divergent way. So you can see there's sort of this nice symmetrical gait here, and a little bit asymmetric gait on the left. And that's very sad. So what happens, it turns out, is that some of the stepping stones to robust walking, like a symmetric sort of gait where you're sort of raising one leg and then the other, it may not immediately help you walk farther. And so if you search divergently, then you may be more able to kind of pick up on those key stepping stones that will later enable robust walking. And we can kind of stretch this paradigm a little bit more. So this is this next video will look at if we try to evolve not just the brain, but also the body of the robot. So we'll search through the space of what are called virtual creatures. If you use an objective-based approach in this sort of domain, typically what happens is you'll get one creature out. So you start evolution, and it'll kind of converge to the best creature. And if you think of this from a biological point of view, it seems a little strange that you'd run evolution and get one thing out. It'd be cooler if we could run evolution and get many things out. And it would be more like natural evolution in some sense, in that, well, evolution was natural evolution was one run sort of on Earth, and it created lots of different things. And so if we do a divergent search process in this space of virtual creatures, then what actually we do find is that we get a diversity of different things within one run. So once again, evolution is creating, in this case, not just the controller for this robot, but also the body itself. And it starts from very simple blocks, and it invents these creatures. So we have this little scorpion kind of guy, information might have either. So also kind of technology sort of branches outwards. You find lots of different things you can use and recombine in different ways. So it's interesting that it seems like there's some growing understanding that in these different processes of evolution and innovation in science and technology, that maybe the objective-based approach of setting some really ambitious objective and trying to march there doesn't seem to work all that well all the time. And yet it seems like in society there's this sort of cultural wave that's sort of cresting where objective-based thinking is sort of everywhere. In the US at least, the education system is sort of increasingly focused on achievement tests and always trying to make these numbers march up, even though education must be more complicated than these silly mazes I was showing earlier. Similar to the ways we fund science is often very, very objective-based. You show exactly what it is you're going to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, and you have to convince someone that this is going to actually work. And maybe even in your own careers, there'll be these metrics that are imposed upon you that will decide your pay or your bonus, and you may know that they don't really make any sense when you're explicitly trying to maximize them, and yet they may be required anyways. So this is my attempt to kind of extrapolate a little bit from the microcosm of evolutionary robotics to something more general. And this inspired, a lot of this work was done in collaboration with my PhD advisor, Ken Stanley, and we actually tried to make a popular science book that kind of expands upon this. And I want to close with a quote from one of our earliest papers, which was to achieve your highest goals, sometimes you have to be willing to throw them away. So if you found this talk interesting, the book is there, and feel free to email me or to my web address. So thank you.